Go ahead.
Throughout history, mankind has struggled with the concept of misfortune falling upon those who appear to be living virtuous and worthy lives, while at the same time, people who are known to be immoral, evil, or generally distasteful appear to be blessed with abundance and favor. Despite their desire to live morally just lives, many people in history are seen encountering incredible struggles. Their peers look on and are unable to understand why they are suffering the hardships which come their way. Similarly, many people who have been well known as evil or immoral appear to receive incredible worldly blessings and prosperity, as well as power and influence. This conflict causes many to ponder why bad things happen to good people. St. Augustine struggled with understanding the purpose of human suffering in his book, City of God, and clearly states the struggle in his book 2, chapter 2, stating, "This question then arose, why did these divine blessings extend also to the godless and the ungrateful? And why did the hardships inflicted by the enemy fall alike on godless and godly?" Augustine, in his writings, introduces theories as to why good things happen to bad people and why bad things happen to good people. One theory he proposes is that God creates trials in our life as consequences for our actions. Augustine also states good may follow a bad person in order to keep people from doing good for gains, while bad befalls good people to remind them of the possibility of negative consequences for their actions. Nicias presents an example of unfortunate circumstances following a man of excellent reputation. Nicias was a well-known man who always sought peace, but he was forced into war despite his desire to prevent it. Meanwhile, Alcibiades, a man who provoked the idea of war until it became a reality, was allowed to retreat from the dangers of war while clearly losing to the Athenians. The book of Job introduces a man who was known to be God-fearing and God-honoring. Within Job's story, it becomes clear God allows trials to face good men for a divine reason, which mankind may be unable to understand. At the conclusion of his book, at the conclusion of the book of Job, it is understood that God allows these trials into man's life in order to bring himself glory, though it may be impossible for man to see these trials as anything other than pain. In the beginning of his book, The City of God, St. Augustine contemplates why good things befall bad people and bad things befall good people, and introduces the now popular idea that what happens to people is a direct result of their actions. Augustine states in his book, in Book 1, Chapter 9, first they consider in humility the results of their actions. First they consider in humility the sins which have moved God's indignation, so that he has filled the world with dire calamities. And although they are free from criminal and godless wickedness, they do not regard themselves as so far removed from such wrongdoing as not to deserve to suffer the temporal ills which are the recompense of sin. Augustine proposes the idea that the people will suffer misfortunes due to their actions, such as when an individual participates in something that is offensive to God in the slightest way, even if the person is not aware it is offensive. He is then punished by God. In today's Christian worldview, it is common to accept Augustine's view in which bad things befall good people due to their actions. People in today's culture often believe when they strive to do good deeds, they deserve to be rewarded for their actions. Furthermore, people who live under the fear that if somehow their actions are wrong or in error, they will be punished as a result. However, the biblical teachings indicate man lives in a fallen world and does not deserve anything besides death. Concluding, actions or deeds do not dictate blessings, rewards, punishments, and sufferings. Within City of God, Augustine continues to expand why positive and negative experiences are allowed to happen to the people of the world. Augustine explains these experiences are to keep men from becoming jealous from what others may possess, as well as the power they may have obtained. Augustine states, "But he has willed that these temporal goods and temporal evils should befall good and bad alike, so that the good things should not be too eagerly coveted when it is seen that the wicked also enjoy them, and that the evil should not be discreditably shunned when it is apparent that the good are often afflicted with them." He also clarifies evils can happen to both good and bad people in order to make people aware trials, struggles, and misfortunes can happen to them as well. This concept compels wonderment as to why only some people are affected in the receiving of blessings, rewards, punishments, and sufferings, while others are not, causing Augustine's theory to seem somewhat irrational, since there is no reason for one individual to be treated differently than others. Generally, mankind considers death as one of the most terrifying trials in life. Many times people associate death as a consequence rather than acknowledging all people die. How could God let a virtuous, kindly person die at a young age, or even worse, be murdered? Similarly, how could a loving God allow a young mother or father to pass away, leaving behind an orphan child? Augustine comments on this idea with a very callous statement. However, it is obviously true and an important fact to consider. I am certain of this, that no one has died who is not going to die at some point or at some time, and the end of life reduces the longest life to the same condition as the shortest. Death should not be viewed as a trial which is suffered by someone, because death is inevitable for everyone and is ultimately the punishment of man's nature. The question is then raised, how could God allow horrible events such as murder to fall upon people? In the book Brothers Karamazov, the character Ivan states, I recognize in all humility that I cannot understand why the world is arranged as it is. Men put themselves in blame. I suppose they were given paradise. They wanted freedom and stole fire from heaven even though they knew they would become unhappy. So there is no need to pity them. With my pitiful earthly Euclidean understanding, all I know is that there is suffering and that there are none guilty. That cause follows effect simply and directly, that everything flows and finds its level. Ivan struggles with the idea that there can be a God with the power to end all evils such as murder, robbery, or rape, and yet does not do what is necessary to eliminate these evils. For a Christian, death cannot be viewed as a misfortune which has fallen upon someone such as Ivan does. Instead, it must be viewed as the best reward for enduring life, no matter how short that may be, because death simply marks the beginning of eternal life in heaven. Socrates, who is not a Christian, comes to the conclusion that death is one of two things, stating, death is one of two things. Either it is annihilation and the dead have no consciousness of anything, or, as we are told, it is really a change, a migration of the soul. Socrates comes to realize death is not actually something to be feared. Rather, death is something to look forward to, as everyone dies, and death is either a dream of sleep or migration of the soul, neither of which is something to be feared. All too often, while people can eventually rationalize death, they will continue to struggle with the concept of a child's suffering at the hand of another person, and they cannot reconcile with the fact that there is a God with the power to end the suffering and yet allows the child to continue to suffer. Child suffering is viewed much differently than death, because the children are not leaving to be in the presence of God. Rather, they have to continue living on earth despite suffering, and they do not have the ability to rationalize what is happening. Instead, they just feel pain and fear. If all must suffer to pay for the eternal harmony, what have children to do with it? Tell me, please. It's beyond all comprehension why they should suffer and why they should pay for the harmony. Ivan also introduces the idea of an infant or child suffering and death. Suffering at the hand of someone else is a direct result of sin nature, not a trial placed in the life of man. The people who do evil to others, including children, have directly aligned themselves with Satan and is not a result of God's will. The blame should not be placed on God, but should be placed on Satan. God allows Satan into the world, and also man is given some free will. Unfortunately, immoral and evil people have an impact on even children. Most people will look at a suffering child and be driven to deny or blame God, not acknowledging Satan's hand in the strategy. While at the same time, some people will choose to show unconditional love towards a child, bringing glory to God. When looking at the suffering of children, it is important to acknowledge there is a good God, but it is also just as important to acknowledge there is also the ultimate evil, Satan, who plays a role in everyone's life as part of the ultimate battle between good and evil. God is not the one putting children or ultimately anybody else through misfortune. Rather, Satan is attempting to gain an advantage over God in the battle of good and evil, and yet God ultimately will be able to use the suffering to bring glory to himself. Not only Christians, but also pagans continue to deliberate why bad things happen to good people. Pagans are often considered to be good, yet they too experience misfortune and suffering. Nicias, a pagan of ancient Greece, presents an incredible example of how bad things happen to a good person, while at the same time, Alcibiades, a thorn in Nicias' side, presents an example of good things happening to a selfish and self-deserving person. There is often irony to be found in stories of two men who are seeking different goals. Oftentimes, the individual who appears moral seems to suffer while the immoral man prospers and continually succeeds. The story of Nicias and Alcibiades presents an incredible example of such irony. Nicias was a man who sought peace in all aspects of his life. Additionally, he was known for having a noble character. This noble character of Nicias can be observed within the writings of Plutarch's Life, where it is stated, if he took a man, he was for doing what was sage, and if, as thus was likely, he had for the most part success, he did not attribute it to any wisdom, conduct, or courage of his own. But to avoid envy, he thanked fortune for all and gave glory to the divine powers. Nicias was a man consistently seeking peace and self-control. If Nicias did something that resulted in a remarkable feat or accomplished a specific goal, he would not claim the glory or recognition for himself, but instead he acknowledged the accomplishments came about as a result of the higher powers in order to avoid envy among his peers. Plutarch states, so the nature of Alcibiades was strong and luxurious in both times, and made way for this many serious innovations. Thus it fell out after Nicias had got his hands clear of Cleon, he had not opportunity to settle the city perfectly into quietness. For having brought matters to a pretty hopeful condition, he found everything carried away and plunged again into confusion by Alcibiades, though the wildness and vehemence of his ambition and all embroiled again in a war worse than ever. Plutarch indicates Alcibiades was a man who sought the violence of war and desired power and status. Nicias, despite his desire for peace, was forced into serving in the war he was ultimately trying to prevent. Meanwhile, Alcibiades, his adversary, who was striving for the war, was pulled out of the war, leaving Nicias to lead the troops into a war he did not want from the beginning. The irony found in the morality and misfortune of Nicias and the immorality and fortune of Alcibiades presents a great example, showing not only Christians, but also pagans, oftentimes struggle with the concept of success, following people of poor reputation, and adversity following those with a respectable reputation. The book of Job presents possibly the best example of misfortune and suffering following a God-honoring man, as well as it shows God has a purpose behind the suffering of man, despite being unable to see the reason. The story of Job provides a very strong argument as to why such horrific circumstances can surround a good person. Job was a man who had many possessions and wealth, including a family. Job, according to the biblical writings of Job 1:1-3, was a God-honoring man. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were also 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. Job had a great multitude of possessions and gave all the glory to God and was thankful. Satan despised Job's faithfulness to the Lord and wanted the opportunity to bring the Lord shame. Satan declared to the Lord that Job was only following him because Job had been given so many blessings and rewards. Satan challenged the Lord in Job 1:11. Put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. God allowed Satan to set trials, misfortunes, and sufferings upon Job. Satan was allowed to take everything from Job, including his wife and his children, all of whom died. When these misfortunes did not cause Job to curse the Lord and turn his back on him, Satan then started attacking Job, causing him incredible physical pain and deformities. However, Job still refused to curse the Lord and continued to have faith and rejoice in him. Job's trials were not put in front of him as a result of some bad actions which he committed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, but rather they were for a divine reasoning that was not to be understood by men at the time. The trials were set forth simply to bring glory to God. It is often believed, in order for bad things to happen to an individual, the person must have done something wrong. Even Job's friends believed in order for misfortune to follow someone, the individual must have done something wrong, so they accused and questioned Job about any actions which may have offended God. Job's friend stated, "Remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it." Job later states it is completely irrational to blame God for any problems faced by man, because every man's life is the prosperity of God, or is the property of God. Man was created by God, and every day God blesses every man more than he distributes misfortune. Therefore, man does not have the right to question God. The story of Job and his faithfulness shows how God cannot create the pains in man's life. Rather, he allows them to be experienced as part of his plan, which ultimately will bring him more glory through his main actions. Observing the life of a cancer patient can present many examples of God's higher plan, which may not be understood to man while they are enduring the suffering of the moment. While an individual may be a God-honoring and God-fearing person and has not actively or deliberately committed an act that deserves punishment, such as being stricken with cancer, he still faces his mortality at that moment. At the time of being diagnosed, cancer patients view his circumstances as some of the worst that could surround any person. The general population, while they may not understand the details of how or why, agree that cancer is an extremely painful as well as terrifying circumstance to have to overcome. Cancer patients experience great pains. Parts of their bodies sometimes cease to work as they were designed. Their joints oftentimes cease to move. They experience constant vomiting and shaking, and in some instances, their nerves constantly send sensations of pain to the brain, even though nothing is truly hurting them. Generally, society does not understand it is not only the cancer causing all these pains, but also the treatment and medications the patient has to endure. However, if despite feeling consistent pain and nausea, a patient does not curse the Lord or blame him for the extreme discomfort they are facing, they are giving God a victory in the ultimate battle between God and Satan. By maintaining their faith, knowing his ultimate victory is with Christ in heaven. By not cursing the Lord and instead trusting in him, they are bringing glory to God. But many times God's plan goes even further than just that moment. Even though someone might know they are glorifying God through their disease, it may still be hard to understand why this horrible thing is happening to them. But as time goes on, it becomes incredibly clear. They are there to be a light to others, whether the light be for the other patients, their nurses, or to others who are looking at their faith and seeing something special and different about the person who is not scared and is at peace with what is happening to their body. While being a light and spreading the word of God, they are fulfilling the greatest command in the Bible, the Great Commission. Spreading the word and truth and bringing glory to God is the entire purpose of man, and the suffering of man, whether in the form of disease or any other trial, is just one way out of many God accomplishes his ultimate plan. Even more prevalent accounts exist through history of misfortune following a good person, while fortune follows a bad person, including the story of Nicaeus at the Battle of the Asinaris River, when Nicaeus' men were slaughtered in the river. Nicaeus' men were so thirsty they were drinking from the river, which was filled with their allies' blood. Another instance can be found when Socrates was convicted and had to drink poison as part of his execution, after a lengthy trial where he was accused of corrupting the minds of the youth, while he was simply seeking truth and encouraging the youth to do so also. It is difficult to think about why events like this happen, especially when someone contemplates an almighty and loving God. It is easy to expect a loving God to provide protection, abundance, and favor. St. Augustine struggled with the concept of why God-honoring men experience trials and misfortune in his book, City of God. He comes to multiple conclusions. One theory of Augustine's is that misfortune follows someone of a God-honoring character to remind them of the consequences of sin and immoral acts, while riches and power are given to people who are not God-honoring in order to prevent people from following the Lord for their own gain. Augustine proposes what happens in someone's life is a result of the actions or misdeeds they may have committed. While dwelling on the trials in someone's life, the most terrifying concept to ponder is the concept of death. But Socrates shows that man should not fear death because it is either a dreamless sleep or a transfer of the soul, which is not something to fear. History presents many examples of misfortune following virtuous and worthy people, such as is found in the story of Nicaeus as well as many examples of fortune and blessing coming to immoral or generally distasteful men, such as Alcibiades. The book of Job presents possibly the best example and the best answer as to why bad things befall good, God-honoring men, showing the trials placed in someone's life are there for a reason, which man may not be able to understand. However, it is part of God's divine plan. Man, while enduring trials and suffering on earth, is tempted to follow the seemingly easy path of Satan by denying Christ, Satan's largest desire. However, if man endures the pain and suffering and relies solely on Christ and acknowledges that the ultimate peace and comfort are found in heaven through Christ, then man is bringing the ultimate glory to God by not allowing Satan to distract him from the eternal salvation and peace he will know in heaven. Ultimately, the entire purpose of man is to bring glory to God, and an immense amount of God's glory can be seen through suffering.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ganske. We'll begin in just a moment. All right. In your paper, you argue fairly clearly that there does not appear to be a sort of right that humans have to expect a pleasant and blithe experience from God. Yes, God does influence our lives. He's very much guiding the progress of our lives, and for us to say, because I am Fritz Henriks, I deserve to have these pleasant accommodations in life. And that position seems has no basis except in a sort of innate human selfishness. And yet, if you remember the story of Griselda in Chaucer, Griselda marries Walter, and Walter just makes life hell for her. Takes away her children, torments her, and through it all, Griselda says, whatever you desire. And it responds just like Job. Job, God let Satan just throw all this stuff at him. And yet, God could stop it. And yet Job says, you know what, God, for better or worse, I will praise you and I will honor you. And it's certainly in the case of Job and Griselda, you look at them and you go, wow, that's impressive. If the guy is sitting in the theater is chewing his popcorn too loud, I want to, turn over and punch him. And, it's very easy to get irritated in life. And, the stuff that goes on between us human beings, we can have a really short fuse with people. And, Griselda and Job both seem to be kind of superheroes of, as Chaucer calls it, patience. That they take it. And yet, at the same time, people respond to Walter saying, what a jerk. This guy would do this sort of stuff to his wife. Not only shows that he's not loving, but he's a sort of devil. And in the case of Job, when God allows Satan to strike down his children, remove his wealth, afflict his body with pain, it seems you could very easily respond and say, you know what? God, there's absolutely nothing I can say as to why you should do anything else. I mean, if I made a Lego model, why should I be required to put it into a glass case and preserve it forever instead of destroying it and, or putting firecrackers in it and blowing it up? It's mine, and it's very easy to see. Sure, yeah, we are God's creation. He can do with us whatever He wants. And yet, you talk about real world suffering of people, and I just watched my brother have his 23-year-old son die in very difficult circumstances. Because a boy that had physical, relational, spiritual, emotional problems for years. My brother worked to do what he could to father and to guide this very disturbed child. And then he dies. And all of my brother's efforts seem to have, in a sense, gone for naught. And you look at a circumstance like that, you say, God, what are you doing? if you think this is just, well, yeah, also just listening to my brother was saying, I know now more desperately than any time before how much I need God. And I was thinking, man, this is the God that could have saved your son, You can say it was Satan that killed him, but, God could have stopped Satan. So God, in any sense, God could have done it. And so, honestly, there seems to be nothing that we can say that would allow us to look at God and say, that was wrong. You should have allowed that boy to live to a ripe old age and have, a room full of grandchildren gathered around him when he died. That's obviously very silly thinking. And yet, to have these sort of things go on, how do we not come to the conclusion that God is just, He's got an influence?
I think it's important to think about the fact that the wages of sin is death. So when Adam directly defied God and ate from the apple, his sin follows down to us, and through that we continually sin. So each breath we take is, in and of itself, a miracle that God has provided to us. We don't have to consciously think, oh, I need to move each organ in my body to breathe. That is done through our subconscious and through God. God's giving us each minute, each second that we have. So in that, He's already being incredibly gracious and giving us much more than we deserve. I think that sometimes it's just time for other people to go sooner than others. And the trials that we face, you see them as such a horrible thing, but at the same time, we don't consciously think about all the things that God has done for us. And I feel like in the past 3 years, that's been a big thing for me, looking at some of the different trials in life, and at the same time, you got to realize that I'm provided with all this. So even though, my spouse may be horrible to me, I'm still being given substantially more than I deserve. And I think that's definitely the most important thing to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that phrase, that little country song that we sometimes listen to, it's in the refrain is, everything that I have is given to me. And that sort of understanding of the whole scope of life as being a great gift of God. And yes, maybe my health is not one of the gifts I get from God. Maybe I get cancer. And with my brother, he's got, a son who's very intelligent, very young, already has a job working at Boeing with him as an engineer. Another daughter is a very accomplished musician and very sweet nature, very lovely girl. And say, you know what? Well, 2 out of 3 is not bad. All right, you've got a lot. And yeah, I don't know if you remember Brothers Karamazov, Ivan brings up the circumstance of the child dying in the snow, and he says, you know what? I don't care how much good there is in life. God made the world where sometimes children are abandoned in the snow, and they sit there crying, and no one comes, and they freeze to death. And Ivan, I don't know if you remember, Ivan says, you know what? You can do all the arguing you want about, how this world, you can reason that God is good in the end, but in the end, I want to give back my ticket. I want to say, God, your world is awesome. It's, sunrise, sunset, I can't criticize them. They're awesome. But you made a world in which little babies are run and stuff. And because of that, I don't want to say you're wrong, God. I don't want to say that, I'm incensed at it, but I just want to give back my ticket. I'm not interested in your reality, God. And how do you think one cannot want to come just to that sense of detachment? To say, you know what, oh yeah, God, you've got all this great stuff around, but in the end, you have a world here where babies die in the snow. And that, I'm going to give back my ticket. I just don't want to be here with you. I mean, it's like you go to somebody's party, and it's a great party, everybody's having a great time, but, in the back room, all the guys are, looking at pornography. And you say, you know what, a lot of great things about this party, but I'm going to leave. I don't want to be here. This is tasteless. And how do you not come and say, you know what, God, great world, beautiful jacaranda tree, quite amazing, but I'd just rather not be here.
Well, when you're looking at the baby who's died in the snow, it sounds totally weird, I guess, in a sense, but I feel like we should be jealous. That baby doesn't have to experience the hardships that come throughout everybody's life. Stubbing your toe is painful, or, parents dying or anything like that. Instead, God's already called them to what, is going to happen to them, whether, I believe they're going to heaven if they're, infants. But even if not, then they don't have to experience the added, pain of the world. When we're talking about that, I feel it's very tough, or in my eyes, it's tough to think of it as a misfortune or a trial or anything like that. I think that it is something that God's graced the baby with, or the child with, because they no longer have to suffer, cold or heat or any kind of pain on earth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ganske. Other questions?
That's Rachel.
Jason, I loved your paper. It's beautiful. My question is, you talk a bit about how God brings these trials and tribulations in our lives, and sometimes we can look back and understand why they happen because they grew us, or as a result you got to meet someone or something, and it's all part of His plan. But do you think there are times like Job where you really don't understand why things happen to you? You may die not knowing, but it's still worth the fight and the faith in God anyway.
Oh, I absolutely do. I think that there are many cases where something unfortunate will follow somebody, and while they may not be able to see it, there are times when you can see it, or somebody in the third person can see it. And yeah, there are probably times when nobody can see it besides God. But ultimately, I think that everything has its purpose to God.
Wonderful paper. So I suppose this question that I have on my mind it could be summarized with the word Christianese, and here's what I'm basically wondering at the moment. There are some strains of Christian theology that lay stress to the idea of God's glory, which is awesome and great. But they can sometimes come across or sound as if God is self-absorbed, like we would imagine a tyrant could possibly be self-absorbed. And then there are other streams of Christian theology that would say things more like God is almighty because He is all-suffering, because He can take it. And that's the example that we're given. I'm just wondering, where do you kind of see yourself within that spectrum? Would you categorize God more according to the first line of thinking that I illustrated, or more like the second?
I think I fall more towards the first, but there is also, the second example in there. I think that God is very, I think that it's an improper term to use, but I guess selfish. I don't know a better way to describe it. But everything He's doing, He did for His own glory, frankly. The reason that we are on earth, He made earth and made man for His own glory. So I feel like in that sense He is selfish, but seeking glory for Himself. But at the same time, He's giving so much to us that we can't see it as selfishness, because through His desire for His own glory, He's giving at the same time. So yeah.
Okay, let me think about it. So I'm thinking, so we talking about like, in the Bible it seems to say that you kind of just stay in that abusive relationship. You just stay there and you endure it. Now, we would think that the logical response is, get out, divorce him, it's over, right? So do you think that you should, if God has like given you a punishment, or I guess is putting you through trials, do you just sit there and take it, or do you try and fight against it? Like, when you are diagnosed with a horrible disease, do you do everything in your power to fight against that, or do you say, God wanted that fate for me, and I should just take it if God gave it to me?
In regards to the cancer thing, I feel very strongly that we need to fight against it. We're given the ability and the technology currently to fight it. And I think that if you aren't going to fight it, I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it, but the only way I can think is that's basically suicide. And in that, looking at it that way, most everyone would agree that that is wrong. You're taking your life, which is really God's life. In the example of the abusive relationship, I think that that's a much more difficult one. It kind of depends. If it starts wearing on your beliefs and your faith, then I think that you need to get out, and because the most important thing for you to think about is your faith in the Lord. But if you're able to keep focused on the Lord, your suffering can be seen from other people, and a lot of times other people will wonder why that person isn't, angry about it and is just accepting it. So I think that the circumstances kind of dictate that.
I really like that response, thank you. And I was also thinking, do you think God puts people through things that they can't handle, or that they can't come out of with a positive, opinion of, or by learning something or by gaining something through it?
I personally don't believe so. I have been surrounded by a lot of suffering the past 3 years, I guess, and throughout it, I've never seen even remotely somebody who's not being, loved on or cared for or something like that. And I think just in any case, you're bringing glory to God because you're showing love or something like that. I've seen children abandoned in hospitals, and yet the nurses will sit there and do something for the child. I don't think that there is anything that can happen on earth that doesn't have a higher purpose that will glorify God.
Thank you.
I wanted to return a little bit to the previous question asked by Mr. Henry about the baby dying in the snow, and I want to get back my ticket. Or similarly, in the book of Job that you mentioned, curse God and die. Is it even worth it? Sure, maybe life is a blessing, but maybe it's not worth all the suffering that comes along with it. And your response was a little interesting to me. There's definitely a lot of truth in that. It's almost merciful or gracious to that child doesn't have to go through all the suffering that the rest of us who survive to adulthood do. But that I feel like that kind of plays even more into the notion that, well, it's not worth it. Like, we shouldn't even be here. Maybe we should even take our own lives. What would you say to that? Is there something about life? Sure, there's a lot of suffering, and God only knows how much suffering everyone has to endure. But is there something else about life that makes that suffering worth actually living?
I think that if we are fortunate enough to live into adulthood, into the age of understanding, then we clearly have the purpose to do what we can to glorify God. I think that in killing yourself, you're hindering that ability. So I think that suicide and stuff like that is not justifiable for mainly that reason. We ultimately have purpose that we are to fulfill if we make it that far. If we don't, then that's unfortunate and all that. But at the same time, like I said earlier, then congratulations. At the same time, it's sad to say, but that's how I feel. But yeah, I think that.
So is it, I'm sorry, just to follow up, is it a bit of, is it that we have a responsibility
Yeah.
to stay alive, or is it that, that responsibility, then makes it actually worth the life?
I think that we need to do everything in our power that God has given us to stay alive. I think that when you take your own life, you're not taking your life, you're taking the life that God had a plan for, or could have used.
This is kind of based off of the past two questions, actually. But when you're responding to Josh was kind of asking, like, given the case of a disease or something, and not really doing anything about it, you replied that that would be, in a sense, suicide. But couldn't it also be viewed as an act of humility to God by fully giving him the reins on your situation and fully trusting his plan for you instead of trying to still control it in any way that you can?
I think that we are given the medications, the technology that we have by God, and we are to use everything that he's given us. I think that I can understand why some people would think that it'd be, I guess, moral to just accept it. But I strongly believe that everything put in our lives is there for a reason, and we need to use everything that is put into our lives. So, in an example of cancer, chemotherapy was created. It's been, studied, and I think that if you don't go through the act of chemotherapy, then I think that's just not morally correct, because you have the ability in many cases. In other cases, you may not have the ability, and I know people who have not made it because there is no cure. But in that case, I think that you go through the treatment that they do have, because at the same time, you're there to possibly find a cure for another person, the next person. I've been on studies and stuff where they've been able to use my tests and further treatment. So I think that you need to use everything that God's given you.
Here's another follow-up to that. But would it still be, in a sense, suicide if you don't go the mainstream way of chemotherapy? You try to do something else that isn't really studied and doesn't have a percentage on its ratio, but it's just a different way that isn't necessarily the normal medical way?
Yeah, on that, honestly, I don't know. That's a tough one, because if it goes right, then you completely just change the world, like many of the people have with immunotherapy recently. Now, a 3-year treatment is, I think it's like down to 6 months. And so I think that in some cases, if there's like a a logical explanation to how it's gonna work, how it will work, then I think that's okay to experiment with, I guess, in a sense. But I think that if you're going for something like, frankly, just eating fruits and vegetables, and saying that'll conquer cancer, we have studies that showed the chemotherapy works. We don't really have studies that show that a carrot will cure cancer.
Yeah.
So I think that it kind of depends on like what kind of experimental treatment are you using.
So in the last hour, 300 children were born in Africa who will die of starvation in the next 6 months. Is that God's plan? Based on your paper?
I think that it is. The child is still, ultimately going to go they're going to pass through this world without the suffering. Yeah, they have the suffering of starvation at the time, but I think that ultimately they will be blessed with the lack of trial on earth.
We've kind of been avoiding the topic of God's judgment and suffering, and I'd like to go back to that. It seems that what Yvonne calls mere Euclidean thinking is the assumption that evil is usually, or evil in people's lives is usually the consequence of their own misdeeds. And I mean, there's so much of life that just works that way. You know, you do something stupid, you're gonna have the consequences. You're not careful when you wash the dishes, you're gonna break dishes. You don't work hard on your GBT paper, it's not gonna, sparkle with great ideas. You don't work hard at running, you're not gonna build endurance. And so, I mean, so much of what happens in life is just the outcome of our choices. And, whether cancer is the result of choices or not, there still seems to be a big picture that, hard things are the result of God's judgment. And yet there does seem to be just the happenstance in life, things that happen that seem not to have a connection to the normal order of our own actions. And how do you distinguish between things where you should say, you know what, I lost my car keys, it's going to cost $250 to get a new one, and you know what, I have always been so careless, I just put those things down anywhere all the time. Something like that where you can look at life and say, hey, this is the consequence of what I've done. And other things where you have to say, you know what, I know this is a really hard thing in my life, but I need to stop beating myself up that this is this judgment of God about this, How do you make that distinction between things where you need to say, no, this really is not God's judgment, or, you know what, maybe this might be something that I need to see God's hand in, specifically against me?
I think that one of the biggest things is the simple idea of cause follows effect. You know what I mean? I set my keys on the piano and I forget my keys on the piano. That's not something God did. That's something I did, and I know that I'm not going to remember that they're there. I think that would be something that isn't God's plan or God's intervention, I guess. While in the case of, say, something like cancer, many cancers are created by a certain cell just deciding not to function the way it's supposed to. And that's not something that we do physically. That, in my case, I didn't do anything that we know of, at least, that caused that specifically. But I think that there was God's hand in that. While I think that other stuff like riding your bike and you fall down, you put yourself there. I don't think that is something that God did to you. So I think that it kind of depends on if you had control over it. If you have control over it, then I don't know if it's necessarily God's intervention, but I do know that God would most likely use it somehow.
Mm-hmm. All right, so it sounds like basically what you're saying is that there's not a sort of cause and effect relationship between your particular actions and the suffering that you're going through, that should not be seen as a sort of indication of any sort of judgment of God against you.
I think so. I mean, I'm sure that there are exceptions as there are in everything, but I feel like if it's simple law that we know and understand, as in the keys won't get up and move by themselves, we put them down, then I think that is not God's intervention.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Sort of going off that idea of individual actions, not blaming God for people sinning, basically. Bad people do bad things that have bad consequences. But what do you say the concept, I guess, of karma, where, you do bad things happen to you?
I don't think that is, I don't believe in karma. I think that if you do something, then it's either gonna be, I guess in a sense there is karma, and that after we die, we face, the ultimate judge, and every sin will be shown, and if not, then you're just gonna be accepted. And I think that ultimately on earth, there's no such response.
I love how beautiful, kind of like your acceptance and resolution, of this is God's will, is a beautiful picture, I think, of the Christian walk. How would a Christian, though, avoid the danger of kind of becoming apathetic in that, of just saying, this is just God's will, and you don't have the struggle, you don't have the joys, the sorrows, you just sort of, that's it. So how would you avoid that pitfall?
So I think that falls down again to what we are able to do. If we're able to prevent something, we need to do that in order for us to be able to glorify God. I think that when we've been put in a situation, we shouldn't just say, oh, God's going to do it. I don't need to do anything. Say there's, I don't know, kid that's hanging on a cliff or something, and not sit there and say, oh, that's God's will, just let it happen. I think that we then need to, we were put there for a reason, and we need to go save the child or something like that. I know that's a weird example, but I think that when we're placed somewhere, then we need to do that. In the case of like family members dying, I think that it should be, I think that what we believe, or I guess our action that we currently do towards death is we feel bad, not necessarily just for them, but for us. I think that we need to be sorry that they're gone and we need to miss them, but I think that it's not an appropriate thing to be mad or sad that they're, I guess sad for them. I think we need to be happy for them. I think that at the same time we're allowed to miss them. We're allowed to wish that this hadn't happened, but I think ultimately we need to be rejoicing.
Yes, Paula? So then would a long-term, let's say, disease or a long-term struggle, would you consider that to be a greater blessing than just a short-term trial or problem? Would you think they're both the same, or is one a greater good than the other?
I don't think that there's necessarily a greater good, because I think that when one thing happens, it's just going to be a chain of events that follows. So whether it's the small event, like say the flu that kept you in home so that you had to go later or something like that, I think that will cause a different chain of events. But if you have a longer disease, then at the same time you're able to use that initial disease through the rest of it. So I think that there isn't necessarily a greater good in one or the other, because both will ultimately change what's going to happen.
Yeah, I would say, as much as we talked today about the question of God having suffering in life, it appears that suffering is a pretty big part of what makes us real people. I mean, watch my brother go from a kind of a sort of abstract Boeing engineer, who always for him God had been a very theoretical question, to somebody who really is kind of living and breathing the need for God. And just the times in my own life where I've seen that God is most real and evident in very personal ways in the most difficult times. It appears that suffering and going through suffering is a big part of us growing up and becoming the people that God would have us to be. And can you say anything about, you might say, just the importance of suffering to living life in its full form?
I think that our suffering isn't always something that we can act upon. I feel like it's something that may change our lives. Say you want to go on vacation or something like that, and you get sick, so you have to go maybe the next week. I think that everything is, all the sufferings are there to dictate what's going to happen in our lives, and God will be able to use it.
Thank you.
Mr. Paper, great job tackling that question.